Tywin Lannister sat in the solar of Harrenhal, listening to the distant echoes that seemed trapped within that ancient fortress's blackened halls. He was not a man for ghosts nor superstition, but here, in the seat of the once proud Harren the Black, Tywin could feel the weight of centuries pressing in. The wind whispered along the jagged towers, and on this night, it felt almost like a portent. A Lannister listened to portents only so far as they indicated an advantage or a threat. He wanted to be sure he was not missing any signs of danger. In an antechamber 2 flights below, Gregor Clegane stood waiting for orders. Even though he was silent as a statue, every soldier in the hallway gave him a wide berth. Ser Gregor, the mountain that rides, served House Lannister with a brutal efficiency. He had sacked villages, burned fields, and spread terror in the name of the Golden Lion. His skill at killing was legendary. He had no real love for House Lannister, but Tywin paid well and saw to his needs, which were simple enough. Gregor required no ceremony nor flattery, only the chance to unleash violence with few consequences. The war had stretched on. The War of the Five Kings, they were calling it. Starks in the north, Greyjoys on the seas, Baratheons both at King's Landing and on the storm-lashed shores of Dragonstone, and a boy king who wore the golden crown courtesy of Tywin's own maneuverings. Tywin had shaped events with his usual ruthless cunning, but even for him, the tides of conflict grew increasingly difficult to manage. The Northmen had proven stubborn. Robb Stark, that young wolf, had dealt more defeats to Lannister forces than Tywin would have liked, leaving cracks in the Lannister front that had to be rapidly sealed with alliances or coin. For the moment, the Lannisters held the advantage in manpower. Yet Tywin was not naive. A single miscalculation could turn the tide. He looked around the solar, the candlelight dancing across old, soot-caked walls. He had begun to suspect that men he counted on might be faltering in loyalty or nerve. Roose Bolton was somewhere in these halls as well, and though House Bolton fought beneath the Stark banner, Tywin understood that alliances in war could shift like river reeds in a strong current. He pondered each piece on the board. His mind worked in layered stratagems, one nested behind the other like a puzzle box. In the end, Gregor Clegane was but a tool in Tywin's arsenal, a vicious dog to be unleashed. If the day came when Gregor was no longer an asset, Tywin knew what to do. He recalled the words of his father, Tytos, a man far gentler, and in Tywin's estimation weaker than himself. If you keep a vicious dog, you must feed him well, and if you fear he'll bite you, best to put him down before he does. Tywin had always taken that advice to heart more seriously than Tytos ever had. But tonight, Tywin did not fear Gregor's bite. He only wondered if the behemoth might still prove too unsubtle, too vicious. Yet the reports from the Riverlands told him that fear was spreading wherever the mountain's men had passed, and that fear served House Lannister well. It kept lords in line, made rebellious villages think twice before aiding the Starks or Tullis. Tywin would send Gregor out again soon, to sow further terror in the foothills around Riverrun or to break the spirit of the locals near the Twins. He was making final decisions about that now. Outside Harrenhal's thick walls, night had deepened into a starless black. Torches glimmered in the courtyard. The garrison was large, hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers wearing the proud red and gold of House Lannister. Leaning over a map spread on his table, Tywin tapped a finger against the lines that marked the trident. He was calculating where best to strike, how to guard supply lines, which local lords might be turned with gold. In his mind, the war was as much about alliances, coin, and cunning as it was about swords. War was an exercise in cold logic, not just bloodshed. But he also knew the value of overwhelming force, especially when used to crush an enemy quickly. He reached the final decision. He would send Gregor and a retinue of men to the lower passes near Riverrun to draw out the remainder of the Tully forces or any northern outriders who roamed those lands. Let the mountain kill and pillage enough to force Robb Stark to respond, or at least to pull men away from his other plans. Tywin also considered the need to keep Gregor in check. He would assign a few watchers, men loyal more to House Lannister than to the mountain personally, to track his movements and ensure no step was taken without Tywin's knowledge. That would do. Late that night, Tywin summoned Gregor to the solar. The mountain ducked his head to pass under the doorway. Standing at well over 7 feet, he loomed like some monstrous hound on its hind legs. He removed his helm, revealing a broad, brutal face with deep-set eyes that were as impassive as stone. A fresh scar ran along his jaw, courtesy of some northern blade, but it seemed not to trouble him. "You will leave at first light," Tywin said. "Riverrun is pinned down by our forces, but the Tully supply lines still run from scattered villages. Hunt them, root them out, make certain the small folk fear to support the Tully cause. If you meet Robb Stark's outriders, crush them. Leave no survivors to sow confusion." Gregor's voice rumbled, low and deep. "As you command, my lord. Take 500 men. Move quickly. You'll have 3 days of provisions from our stores. After that, let them eat the fields." Gregor nodded, understanding that Tywin granted him license for a campaign of terror. Once, this might have made him smile, but Gregor Clegane did not truly smile. A savage spark lit in his gaze, though, like a man who has been gifted with a new war hammer. He bowed his head in the barest gesture of respect and, without a further word, withdrew from the solar. Tywin watched him go, the mountain's footfalls echoing off the high rafters. The Lord of Casterly Rock listened to them with the cold certainty that the Lannister grip on the war had just tightened by a fraction. Gregor would return with blood on his sword, and with the next piece of this brutal game suitably arranged. At dawn, Gregor departed. He and his mounted retinue streamed from the gates of Harrenhal, banners snapping in the wind. Through the early morning mist, the ground shook beneath the thunder of hooves. The soldiers who accompanied him rode in uneasy quiet, for these men had seen what Ser Gregor was capable of. Only a few of them carried any illusions about chivalry or knightly honor. The rest had accepted that they were part of a savage warband, led by the largest, most dangerous knight in the realm. For 2 days, the mountain and his band rode hard, descending into the fertile river valleys. Here the war was evident everywhere. Burnt farmsteads, corpses still swaying from trees. Some had the sigil of House Tully pinned to their clothing. Others wore the dire wolf of House Stark. The majority, though, were small folk caught in the jaws of conflict. Gregor took no note of this carnage. He had seen such scenes so many times before that they merged into one great tapestry of violence, a continuous backdrop to his life. On the 3rd day, the Outriders reported a small hamlet rumored to be sheltering Tully scouts. Gregor gave the order to move in quietly. The hamlet consisted of less than 20 huts, ringed by farmland. Dawn came pale and gray. Gregor moved with a speed surprising for a man of his size, dismounting to stalk through the fields. His men circled around, cutting off any route of escape. The hamlet's inhabitants were still stirring from sleep, and many never got the chance to rise from their beds. Gregor's men kicked down doors, seized terrified farmers, demanded to know where the Tully men were. A scrawny youth tried to flee. Gregor impaled him on a massive greatsword. Screams broke the dawn's silence. The whimpers of mothers, the cries of children. Gregor swept through it all like a nightmare unleashed. They found a single Tully scout cowering in one of the huts, half-dressed in his leather jerkins, but no more. Gregor dragged the man out into the dusty path that ran through the hamlet. The scout tried to speak, but Gregor had no interest in his words. The only reason he did not kill him outright was to glean if there were more. With 2 of his men holding the scout's arms, Gregor pressed his gauntlet hand to the man's face, nearly covering it entirely. "Where are the rest of you?" he asked in that terrible, growling voice. The scout babbled, claiming ignorance, or perhaps naming some place, but Gregor's patience was short. He squeezed until blood poured from the scout's nose and mouth. When the man went limp, Gregor flung him aside with a contemptuous flick of his arm. The hamlet was torched, and its meager stores of grain seized. Gregor and his men rode on. This was the kind of task Tywin had set for Gregor countless times. He was Tywin's instrument, a monstrous presence that waged psychological war as effectively as physical. Fear was a potent weapon, yet something festered in Gregor's mind, something that had been stirred by the monotony of sacking and burning. The war was dragging on. He could sense a shift in the loyalty of certain men around him, see the uncertainty in their faces. Soldiers whispered that Robb Stark had captured Jaime Lannister in the Whispering Wood and now held him captive. If a man as skilled as Jaime could be taken, what did that say about the Lannister cause? But Gregor cared little for Jaime's well-being. He only cared that the war was no longer a straightforward exercise of punishing the weak. These northern forces had proven more formidable than expected, and Tywin, for all his gold and cunning, had begun to seem less invulnerable. Days turned into weeks. Gregor's raids scattered Tully supporters in the region. He clashed with a few outriders of the north, leaving bloody fields in his wake. When he grew restless, he took what he wanted: food, drink, the spoils of war. Yet there was a new edge to his restlessness. With each passing skirmish, with every arrow that hissed past him, Gregor found himself thinking of Tywin's constant orders. Kill, burn, terrorize. Go here, come back, do it again. Gregor might have accepted this unthinking routine if not for the half-whispered rumors among his men of shifting alliances in the realm. Roose Bolton, they said, might be making secret treaties. The Freys might be preparing to betray Robb Stark, or perhaps Robb was outmaneuvering them. Stannis Baratheon had marched on King's Landing and been repelled. Rumors flew that Tyrion Lannister had orchestrated a great wildfire explosion that saved the city. All of it was swirling, uncertain. The only constant was that Tywin demanded more brutality. Yet the men who rode with Gregor were not entirely deaf to the realm's politics. He caught them whispering sometimes about how Tywin might be losing his grip. One soldier in particular, a man named Rafford, suggested in a half-drunken state that Tywin's hold on Harrenhal was tenuous. Gregor overheard but did not punish him. The half-formed notion of Tywin's vulnerability piqued something in Gregor. Men always whispered about their lords, but it was not often that they whispered the word weak in the same breath as Tywin Lannister. Despite his size, Gregor was not a simpleton. He lacked refinement, but he recognized advantage when he saw it. Tywin had always been that looming presence, the puppet master behind him, giving him license to kill. Now, for the first time, Gregor envisioned a day when the Lord of Casterly Rock might no longer hold all the reins. What if Tywin, old lion that he was, had overlooked the wolf at his back? A man as large and fearsome as Gregor Clegane needn't remain a mere tool forever. If Tywin's bastions of power cracked, Gregor might break away. Of course, that was mere speculation. Gregor was not prone to deep reflection, but the idea would not leave him. They continued to harry the small folk. Gregor's presence alone was enough to drive entire villages to flight. In time, he received a raven from Tywin, demanding his return to Harrenhal for fresh orders. Gregor, as always, complied. But the seeds of doubt and possibility had been planted in his head. Harrenhal was different upon his return. He noticed the tension in the gates, the stiff posture of the guards. Some new fiasco had befallen Tywin, or so the rumor mill claimed. Gregor quickly learned that Robb Stark had outmaneuvered another Lannister force in the west, capturing strategic positions near Ashmark. Tywin had evidently left Harrenhal to chase the Stark army, leaving a skeleton garrison behind. The fortress's new caretaker was a castellan who was all nerves and insecurity. He practically stumbled over himself to greet Ser Gregor. Gregor felt an odd sense of liberation, almost without Tywin's presence. Harrenhal was a place of uneasy quiet. Gregor did as he pleased. He visited the armory, sharpened his greatsword, forced the local blacksmith to hammer out improvements to his armor. The blacksmith's apprentice cowered, aware of the stories, but Gregor ignored him as one might ignore a fly. The men in Gregor's retinue drank and indulged themselves in the fortress's ample stores, forcing the frightened servants to supply them. All the while, Gregor waited, uncertain if Tywin would return in victory or defeat. Days later, a battered Lannister party rode through Harrenhal's gates. They carried the lion banners, but many were torn or stained. Their armor was scratched, battered, some spattered with dried blood. Gregor strode into the courtyard, stepping over fallen timbers to meet them. At their head was Amory Lorch, whose face was drawn and pale. Gregor recognized that look as a mixture of fear and shame, the same expression that lesser knights wore after a punishing defeat. Lorch dismounted and spoke quietly to Gregor. "The young wolf ambushed us. It was a rout. Lord Tywin commands that all able forces gather at once. He expects to face Robb Stark again on the field. We must rejoin him." Gregor stared down at Lorch, his gaze cold. "Where is Tywin?" "About a day's ride northwest, encamped at the Red Fork. He's assembling what remains of our forces, but he needs more. The Starks have hammered our outriders." Gregor weighed this news in stony silence. He felt neither fear nor shock, merely the awareness that Tywin's position grew more precarious. After a moment, he nodded and led his men to prepare for the march. That evening, they rode out in a grim procession, the Lannister banners flapping in a bleak wind. The men were subdued, their bravado slipping, as if some invisible weight pressed upon them. Gregor said little. He rarely spoke to the men except to give orders or bark instructions. They reached Tywin's encampment by dusk the next day. Tents sprawled along the banks of the Red Fork. Sentinels patrolled the perimeter, anxious and watchful. Even from a distance, Gregor could see that this was not the proud, disciplined Lannister host of months ago. This was a battered army, still large enough to intimidate many foes, but no longer exuding the same unshakable confidence. As Gregor rode through the camp, men parted before him, but their eyes flicked away. Gregor sensed their weariness, their doubt. He was admitted to Tywin's pavilion without delay. Inside, he found the Lord of Casterly Rock seated at a campaign table strewn with maps and dispatches. Despite the swirl of chaos around him, messengers coming and going, captains debating, Tywin radiated a sort of iron composure. But Gregor, who had been around the Lord long enough, detected tension in his posture, a certain pinched tightness at the corners of his eyes. "You have returned," Tywin said. "Good. We march at first light." Gregor loomed over the map. He saw the outline of the Red Fork, the notations of where Stark forces had been sighted. With an abrupt gesture, Tywin dismissed the other men in the pavilion, leaving just him and Gregor. "You will lead the van," Tywin said. "I will not waste time with pretense. Stark's men have humiliated us in several engagements, but the boy cannot defeat our full might on open ground. I intend to pin him near the fords. You will drive forward, smash anything that stands in our way. When the time comes, Stark will have nowhere to run." Gregor nodded. That was typical Tywin. Direct, forceful, confident in final victory. "And if Stark attempts a flanking maneuver?" Gregor asked, his voice a low rumble. "He cannot flank us if we hold the fords and the high ground," Tywin replied. "We have outriders along the ridges. If the boy tries to slip away, we will catch him. You need only do what you do best. Kill." Gregor's stony features gave nothing away, but inside, he was already seeing the shape of this next battle. Another grand attempt by Tywin to turn the tide. Perhaps it would succeed. Tywin's cunning had carried them far in the past. Or perhaps the young wolf would once more reveal some new tactic. Gregor found himself strangely indifferent as to who eventually won. The war had spilled so much blood that victory felt hollow no matter whose banner flew. Yet for Tywin, victory was paramount. He had everything at stake: family legacy, personal ambition, the fortunes of House Lannister. Tywin would never let that slip away, no matter how many men died in the process. The next morning, the Lannister host marched. Thousands of men in armor trudged across muddy ground, the Red Fork to their left, rolling hills to their right. Archers followed, supply wagons rattled, horsemen clopped at the edges, and the occasional outrider galloped back to relay sightings. The sprawl of it was impressive, but Gregor noticed how some men coughed and struggled to keep pace, how others tightened ragged belts or used makeshift bandages for old wounds. He smelled the fear wafting through the ranks. If these men encountered yet another fierce assault, would they stand or break? Tywin rode near the center, accompanied by a modest guard. Gregor took his place at the van, leading the forward formation. The war horns sounded, their deep note echoing across the foothills. The columns advanced. Dust rose in great plumes underfoot, mingling with the rising sun to cast an almost golden haze. For a moment, the spectacle of war looked almost majestic, like something out of a song. Gregor knew better. Just before midday, scouts returned with urgent news. Stark's forces were positioned not far ahead. They were arrayed in the low hills, perhaps waiting for the Lannisters to come. Tywin halted the host to reorganize lines and ready for an engagement. Gregor cracked his knuckles within his gauntlets, feeling that old familiar rush of anticipation. The thunder of approaching battle was in the air, carried by the hush that fell over the men. Weapons were drawn, banners unfurled. Drums began a slow, pounding beat. Tywin gave the order. Gregor led the charge. The Lannister van rolled forward, their shield wall bristling, swords glinting in the sun. Gregor rode at the forefront, an iron wedge of unstoppable force. The ground trembled under the onslaught of hooves. The men behind Gregor let loose a great shout. Their morale surged, for it always did when they marched behind the mountain that rides. If any single warrior could break the enemy line, it was him. Moments later, the lines clashed. The front ranks of the Northerners met Gregor's assault head-on. Screams and steel collided. Gregor's sword slashed through men with terrifying power, splitting shields and helmets as if they were made of parchment. Horses screamed, "Arrow!" WS word overhead. The swirl of violence consumed the battlefield. Gregor pressed forward, ignoring the arrows that clanged off his thick plate or sank into the armor of those behind him. Each time a Northerner tried to stand against him, the mountain's sword carved through flesh and bone. It seemed unstoppable. Yet the Stark forces were well-disciplined, commanded by capable captains who used the terrain wisely. Archers rained arrows from the hillside, forcing Gregor's men to raise shields. Pikemen advanced, stepping over fallen bodies to try to pin down the Lannister front. At times, Gregor glimpsed smaller cavalry units sweeping along the flanks, harassing the Lannister lines. Through the chaos, Gregor realized that Robb Stark was not present. Perhaps the young wolf was further back, commanding from a vantage point, or maybe he was orchestrating some flank of his own. Gregor felt no fear, but he recognized that this was no simple engagement. The boy had cunning, enough cunning to have stung them multiple times already. After a prolonged struggle, it seemed the Lannister center began to push the Northerners back. Gregor could feel the shift in momentum. He saw Stark soldiers withdrawing up the slope, seeking to regroup. He signaled to his men, spurring them to greater fury. Bodies lay strewn in the grass, the once green hillside painted red. Gregor pressed on, unstoppable, a living engine of death. Then a horn blast signaled from behind. Gregor turned to see chaos erupting in the Lannister rear. Through the dust, he caught glimpses of men in the dire wolf sigil. A second force of Northmen had come from behind the ridge, striking the Lannister lines from the rear. Shouts of alarm rose among Tywin's men. Commands were bellowed. Horns answered in confusion. Stark's pincer closed. Gregor realized Tywin had been outmaneuvered yet again. The resulting melee was chaos. The Lannisters fought desperately. Gregor found himself cut off from the bulk of his men, pinned between the two fronts. He roared in challenge, hacking down anyone in range. But for the first time, he felt the tide swirling precariously around him, as if the largest wave might engulf even the mountain. Despite the panic, Tywin's greater numbers slowly began to tell. Additional Lannister regiments pushed back the second Stark force. The fighting raged for what felt like hours, until at last the horns signaled retreat on the northern side. With disciplined withdrawal, the Stark soldiers broke away in small units, vanishing into the hills. They left behind more casualties than the Lannisters, but the Lannister dead and wounded were not few. The ground was littered with corpses. At the end of it all, the Lannisters held the field, if such a battered patch of ground could be called that. Gregor stood, sword dripping with gore. Dozens of enemy dead surrounded him. His armor was dented, splattered with blood, not all of it his own. Around him, weary men slumped or knelt, some retching from the horror and exhaustion. The day's victory was a hollow one. Tywin had lost still more men, and the Stark army, though forced to retreat, had not been crushed. In the command tent that evening, Tywin was silent with rage. His top commanders waited anxiously for his pronouncements. Finally, he stated that the next move was to pursue the Northmen deeper into their territory. They had to bring Robb Stark to a decisive battle. There was no other way to ensure victory. The war would continue. Gregor listened, half attentive. He saw the flicker in Tywin's eyes, that mixture of anger and a deepening desperation. House Lannister had spent enormous resources on this war. The coffers might not be empty, but neither were they bottomless. Tywin had staked his name, his reputation, on breaking the Stark rebellion. But each time the young wolf slipped away. Weeks passed in forced marches, skirmishes, and the occasional pitched battle. Summer was waning, though the realm was always uncertain about its seasons. The days grew shorter. Supplies ran thin. Lannister morale dipped further. Soldiers grumbled about Tywin's relentless push, the endless death, the lack of plunder. More than once, Gregor saw lines of men trudging like beaten dogs behind the banners. Even the once proud knights under the Lannister banner questioned their next steps, though not openly in Tywin's presence. Tywin demanded obedience, and for now he received it. Then came the final blow to Lannister confidence. Word arrived that Stannis Baratheon had regrouped, forging alliances with some Storm Lords, while Balon Greyjoy continued to ravage the western coasts. Tywin's leadership was stretched in too many directions. King's Landing might be safe for the moment, protected by the victory on the Blackwater, but the rest of the realm was in open chaos. Rumors whispered that certain Lannister bannermen, minor lords who were tired of seeing their levies ground to dust, were seeking ways out of the conflict. Perhaps they would pay lip service to Tywin while quietly meeting with envoys of other powers. Tywin tried to quash such rumors, but he was not omnipotent. The realm was too large, the war too sprawling. The swirl of betrayals, shifting alliances, and mounting casualties weighed heavily on the Lion's shoulders. Gregor, through it all, remained Tywin's blunt instrument. He raided, he burned, he slaughtered as instructed. Yet now he also listened, as men whispered that the Lannisters might eventually lose this war, that Tywin's luck had finally run dry. Gregor had no particular love for the Starks or Baratheons, but he also felt no abiding loyalty to Tywin. The Gold Lord had used him as a weapon, letting him indulge in cruelty without fear of repercussion. But now that might end. The turning point came one dusk, as Gregor and his men encamped a short distance from Tywin's main host. They had been ordered to secure a forward position, protecting a river crossing. After setting up camp, Gregor stood near a fire, methodically cleaning his greatsword. The flicker of orange flames danced across the steel. He listened to the conversation of three men beside him, Rafford, Polliver, and a third soldier known as the Tickler. All were men with black reputations, men who had served Gregor faithfully in his cruelty. But now their tones were hushed, urgent, laced with doubt. "There's talk that our supply lines from the Westerlands have been cut," Rafford said. "Robb Stark's outriders have raided the baggage trains more than once. If Tywin can't feed us, it won't matter how big we are. We'll starve or we'll have to pillage. And there's only so much left to take." "He always finds a way," Polliver argued, but without much conviction. "Tywin's never lost a war, not really." "The times change," Rafford replied. "Every day more men desert. Just this morning, I heard a group slipped off in the night, heading south, maybe to join Lord Tyrell's armies. Or maybe just going home." "What do you think Ser Gregor will do if it all collapses?" the Tickler asked. They fell silent, each glancing at the hulking shape of Gregor. He stood at the edge of the firelight, sword in hand, his helmet resting on a stump. Though he faced away, it was clear he could hear them. The men shifted nervously, but none dared to speak to him. Gregor could sense their fear and their curiosity. For a moment, an image flashed in his mind. Tywin, alone, forced to answer for all the blood spilled. Gregor was the mountain, but he was not a mere puppet. He might slay Tywin just as easily as he would any other man. Would that be wise? Could Gregor seize something for himself in this chaos? Over the next days, the possibility teased at his thoughts. More men deserted. More Lannister positions crumbled. Tywin raged, but he could not be everywhere at once. His line was stretched, and small but painful defeats accumulated. The crowning humiliation arrived with a rider one midday, breathless and bedraggled, announcing that Riverrun was holding firm, that the Freys were dithering about their loyalties, and that a new Stark raiding party had seized the Golden Tooth. Tywin all but lost his composure. In front of his assembled captains, he slammed a gauntlet fist onto the map, scattering wooden markers. "I will not be undone by the treachery of minor lords and the cunning of a whelp. I am Tywin Lannister, and I will flay the next lord who dares betray me." He pointed at Gregor. "Ser Gregor, gather your men. We march tonight. We will retake the Golden Tooth by force if necessary. No half measures." Gregor nodded stiffly. He left the tent, his mind churning. The men around him looked grim. Some tried to bolster their courage with talk of how they had the advantage in numbers, how the Golden Tooth's castle was small. But Gregor saw them exchanging worried glances. They understood that retaking the Golden Tooth would be bloody. And after that, who knew what new setback might greet them? It was at midnight when Gregor Clegane made his decision. The war camp was half asleep, though the watchfires burned. Gregor donned his armor quietly, strapping the plates around his massive torso and limbs. He slid his greatsword into the scabbard on his back, tested the weight. Then he motioned for the men who followed him most faithfully. Rafford, Polliver, the Tickler, a few others, to gather. In a low voice, he gave an order that no one expected. He commanded them to seize the best horses, gather the provisions, and follow him in an altogether different direction from the route Tywin had laid down. The men blinked in confusion. "Ser Gregor? The Golden Tooth is west," Rafford said. "We're to—" Gregor's glare was enough to silence him. "We ride south. If any man tries to stop us, kill him." His tone was as cold and unyielding as the steel he carried. Rafford swallowed. "And Lord Tywin?" Gregor curled his lip. "If he learns of it before we're gone, I'll deal with him myself." A stunned hush followed. But these were not men of chivalry or steadfast loyalty. They were merciless fighters who followed Gregor because he was strong, because he promised them coin and plunder, because he tolerated their sadism. Now, seeing that Tywin's cause might be doomed, they had no great reluctance to join Gregor in betraying the lion, and so they obeyed. They gathered quietly, stirring horses while most of the camp slept or dozed. In small clusters, they slipped away from the main body of men, careful to avoid watch patrols. The faint moonlight revealed them as shadows moving through canvas tents. At the edge of the camp, a sentry challenged them, raising his lantern. Gregor said nothing. He simply rode forward and cut the man down with a single sweep of his sword. The dying guard's gurgle was lost in the night. A few muffled cries followed, but Gregor's men silenced them. Within minutes, they were beyond the camp's perimeter, riding south at a gallop. By the time Tywin's men discovered the betrayal, dawn was near. A watch sergeant found the butchered sentries and the empty spaces where Gregor's retinue should have been. He raised the alarm. In Tywin's command tent, the news fell like a thunderbolt. Ser Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, had deserted in the night, taking a significant portion of the heavy cavalry and enough supplies to sustain them. Tywin's face was carved in granite. "Impossible," he spat. But when more reports came, the scale of the betrayal was undeniable. Men had been slain silently, horses stolen. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Some were angry, others dismayed, still others fearful. If a monstrous dog like the mountain had turned on them, what else might go wrong? Morale, already fragile, threatened to shatter. Tywin swiftly ordered riders to pursue Gregor, but the men he sent out returned empty-handed. The group had too great a head start and had vanished into the labyrinthine roads and wooded paths. In the days that followed, Tywin tried to maintain order. He suppressed all talk of Clegane's treachery with threats and punishments. Yet men whispered anyway. If the mountain had abandoned Tywin, then perhaps Tywin was truly losing this war. Perhaps the old lion was no longer untouchable. Gregor, for his part, led his men south with a purpose. They skirted the edges of the war-torn riverlands, raiding small hamlets when they needed supplies. Some men asked what their plan was, but Gregor offered no grand strategy. He only told them that Tywin was finished, and they would carve out their own power before the war ended, by force if necessary. The men fell in line. Gregor's name alone was enough to inspire terror in the small folk, who had no illusions that an armored giant was any less dangerous when self-directed than he was under a Lannister banner. As they rode, Gregor began to realize that if he truly wanted to crush Lannister power, he could. He knew many of Tywin's secrets, the vulnerabilities in his supply lines, the dispositions of his forces. House Lannister might be the richest in the realm, but riches meant little in open war if men refused to fight for you. Gregor considered forging an alliance with some other faction, perhaps with Roose Bolton, or with the Sellswords that might flourish in the chaos. But forging alliances required a level of diplomacy that Gregor had never practiced. He preferred a more direct approach. He also knew there was one place that would be especially symbolic: Casterly Rock itself, the ancestral seat of House Lannister. It was a fortress many considered unassailable. To seize it or strike at it would be to truly break Tywin's legacy. But was that even feasible? Gregor gave it thought. Tywin was away with most of the Lannister host, fighting in the Riverlands and Westerlands. King's Landing was protected by the King's Guard and other forces loyal to the Iron Throne. But what if the rock was left lightly defended, relying on the assumption that no enemy force would attempt such an audacious assault? Gregor decided to send a few scouts westward to glean what they could about Casterly Rock's defenses. In the meantime, he turned his band of soldiers into a roving, unstoppable wave of pillage, hitting outlying estates that had sworn fealty to the Lannisters. This was how he crushed Lannister power, one piece at a time, sowing terror among their vassals and letting them know that Tywin Lannister could no longer protect them. A lesser man might have found it difficult to strike at old allies. Gregor felt no such qualms. Lord Brax's estate was first. Brax had been loyal to Tywin for years, but that loyalty meant nothing to Gregor. He and his men swept through the estate lands, burning fields, seizing any stores of grain. They cornered a few Brax knights in the main hall, quickly overwhelming them. Gregor personally crushed the skull of Ser Flemont Brax with a single downward blow of his sword. The remaining household surrendered, but Gregor demanded every valuable they had in tribute. The panic was immediate. Word spread that the mountain was now an independent terror, turning on Lannister supporters. Then came the Marbrand lands. For generations, House Marbrand had been one of the most stalwart Lannister bannermen. Their seat at Ashmark had endured the ravages of the war with House Stark. They had men in the field with Tywin, but the castle itself had only a skeleton garrison, enough to keep the peace but not enough to repel a determined assault. When Gregor rode in, his men hoisted no banners. They were recognized soon enough by the castle watchers, who hurried to bar the gates. But it did them little good. Gregor's men battered down the aged gates with rams, flooding the courtyard. Gregor cleaved apart the captain of the guard. Within hours, Ashmark was in his hands. He ransacked the halls, tore down the lion sigils, and set the main keep ablaze, letting thick smoke billow into the sky. Small folk fled in terror, carrying tales of the mountain's fury wherever they went. This series of lightning raids on Lannister vassals terrified the region. Lords who had once proudly rallied to Tywin's call now felt vulnerable. If Tywin could not defend them from his own ex-servant, then what was the point of remaining loyal? Some tried to muster their small garrisons to prepare for Gregor's coming, but few had the manpower. Many fled, taking refuge in other castles or seeking to align with different powers. Chaos spread like a brush fire. All the while, Gregor awaited the information from the scouts he'd sent toward Casterly Rock. His men returned days later, confirming that a significant portion of the Rock's main garrison had marched off to assist in the western campaigns. The fortress was still formidable, its walls built into the rocky cliff, labyrinthine tunnels within, but it was not at full strength. In a dim, torchlit hall of a sacked keep, Gregor listened to the scout's report. Some of his men eyed him, uncertain if he meant to attempt the near impossible. To attack Casterly Rock was madness to most. Yet Gregor was not a man who shrank from violence. He weighed the notion in silence. Tywin would expect that none but an army many thousand strong would dare assault the ancestral seat of House Lannister. Gregor had fewer than 1,000 men, mostly cavalry and raiders. Not enough to lay siege in the normal sense. But if he could exploit confusion, fear, and the possibility of infiltration, perhaps there was a way. On a cold, overcast morning, Gregor made his decision. He would march on Casterly Rock. He assembled his men, numbering just over 600 after all the desertions and casualties in the raids. They were a grim company, hardened by weeks of reaving. Gregor told them the plan in blunt terms. They would ride to Casterly Rock, find a way in, and take what they could. Some of the men, Polliver among them, actually laughed at the audacity of it. But Gregor's presence silenced doubt, and soon enough, they were on the move. Meanwhile, in the field, Tywin Lannister received scattered reports of Gregor's devastation among his bannermen. At first, he refused to credit them. Then evidence grew undeniable. Messages described villages razed, lords fleeing, all at the hands of the Mountain. Tywin's eyes grew cold with fury. He swore that he would drag Gregor back in chains and flay him alive. But to do so required redirecting his forces, which in turn weakened his position against Robb Stark. Tywin raged that a single turncoat knight could not possibly threaten him so deeply, but the reality was that Gregor's rampage was unraveling the Lannister coalition from within. Fear gave rise to suspicion. Suspicion became resentment, and soon the entire war effort was compromised. Unable to let the betrayal stand, Tywin peeled off a large contingent of men from the main host. He sent them west under the command of Adam Marbrand, ordering them to corner and destroy Gregor Clegane. But Gregor's raids were swift and unpredictable, and the region was vast. Marbrand's men found only burnt-out villages, empty keeps, and terrified survivors. Everywhere they went, they heard the same rumor. Gregor was heading for the Rock. When word of that reached Tywin, his composure cracked. In all his years, Tywin had rarely known fear, only caution. But the notion of his own seat, his ancestral fortress, threatened by the Mountain's brutality, was a humiliation he could not abide. He immediately departed with the remainder of his forces to reinforce Casterly Rock. But the journey was long, and time was short. Gregor arrived at the vicinity of Casterly Rock near dusk on a gray, storm-laden day. He halted his company a short distance away, concealed among the craggy foothills. From a vantage point, they could see the rock rising above the sea, a colossal fortress carved, partly from the massive stone of the promontory. Even from a distance, it radiated power, with high walls, watchtowers, and battlements that overlooked the waves below. Inside those walls were storerooms of gold and treasures, the beating heart of House Lannister's wealth. But Gregor did not come merely for gold. He came to break Tywin's name, to show that the lion could bleed. That night, the storm broke overhead, lashing wind and rain across the coast. Visibility was poor, which favored a stealthy approach. Gregor ordered a small contingent to advance on foot, using the labyrinth of outer tunnels that riddled the cliff faces. Legend said that the rock had hidden passages, some leading to sea coves or older mine shafts. Gregor had gleaned enough from local fishermen and captured servants to guess where an entrance might be found. The swirling storm waves crashed against the cliffside. Under the veil of darkness and rain, Gregor led a raiding party around the western approach, descending treacherous pathways to a hidden cove. The sea spray stung their eyes as they clung to the slippery rocks. Lightning flashed, illuminating the towering face of the rock. Gregor moved carefully, his great sword strapped across his back, a shorter blade at his belt for tighter spaces. His men followed. They found the half-submerged cave entrance just as rumored. Cold seawater rushed in and out. They waded in, torches sputtering in the salty air. Once inside, The cacophony of wind and waves dulled to a distant roar. The caverns were dark, echoing. Gregor's men lit torches, pressing forward in single file. Crabs scuttled underfoot. The smell of sea rot was thick. After some twists and turns, they reached a tunnel that ascended sharply. Here, the real infiltration began. They found the way partially collapsed in places, but the echoes of an older age remained. Old wooden supports, hints of steps carved into stone. Gregor led the way, unstoppable, shoving aside rubble or bursting through rotted wooden doors that barred certain paths. Finally, they emerged into a disused sublevel of Casterly Rock's mines. It was well above sea level, a labyrinth of old mine shafts. The walls glinted faintly in torchlight, perhaps veins of gold or iron. Gregor did not linger to admire. He pressed on, searching for a path up into the main fortress. The ground was slick, strewn with old debris. In one place, they found a caved-in section that forced them to backtrack. In another, they discovered an iron gate locked from the other side. Gregor hammered at it with his gauntlet fists until the rusted hinges gave way. The clang resonated in the darkness, but the storm overhead masked most noise. At last, they came to a set of stone steps. As they ascended, the air changed, growing slightly fresher. Then they reached a solid wooden door. Gregor turned to a lean, wiry man named Gorman, who carried a set of thieves' tools. With a bit of fumbling, Gorman managed to manipulate the lock. The door creaked open onto a corridor lit by a few torches on sconces. They had breached the fortress from below. Creeping forward, Gregor and his men advanced. The corridor looked seldom used, but it was clearly within the castle's inhabited levels. They passed storerooms filled with crates and barrels, some containing supplies, others holding ingots of raw metal. No guards were immediately visible, likely due to the storm, but deeper in they would surely encounter resistance. When the first guard patrol appeared, Gregor's men took them by surprise. 2 guards in Lannister colors turned a corner, only to freeze at the sight of shadowy intruders. One opened his mouth to shout. Gregor cut him down with a single stroke, nearly bisecting him. The other guard tried to flee, but Gregor's men dragged him back, pressing a knife to his throat. Gregor demanded to know the location of the main hall, the armory, and the fortress's defenses. The guard stammered out what he could. Then Gregor dispatched him. The infiltration turned into a bloody advance through half-forgotten corridors. Alarm bells eventually rang, though it was unclear whether they were rung by a watchman who had glimpsed movement or from a soldier who stumbled on a corpse. Regardless, Gregor's presence in the castle was soon discovered, and Lannister guards converged. Gregor's men fought fiercely, the cramped corridors favoring small squads rather than massed defenders. The thunder of the storm outside reverberated through the walls. Lightning flashes illuminated the windows, casting jagged shadows in the halls. Gregor led from the front. Any guard that challenged him died in brutal fashion. He smashed a man's face into a stone wall, caved in another's chest with a hammer blow, lopped off heads with that colossal greatsword. Blood splattered tapestries, defiled the golden lion sigils. The defenders tried to mount a more organized resistance near a wide staircase that led to the castle's upper floors. Archers fired down from above. Knights formed a shield wall on the steps. Gregor simply bellowed a war cry and charged, absorbing arrows on his plate armor, knocking shields aside as if they were children's toys. The defenders faltered, seeing this giant tear through them. Gregor's men poured in behind him, slitting throats, kicking men off the landing. The clash echoed horribly. In time, the Lannister garrison was forced to retreat, pulling back to the fortress's central keep, desperate to hold a last line of defense. Gregor and his men swept through corridors, seized storerooms, blocked off passages behind them to prevent counterattacks. The keep's gates were barred from within, so Gregor battered them with a ram improvised from a broken banister. The splintering would give way amid the echo of thunder. The final stand took place in a grand hall, presumably used for feasts or gatherings. Lightning flashed through narrow windows set high in the walls. The Lannister captain, a grizzled man with a scarred cheek, had rallied perhaps 50 men. They stood in a formation near the head of the hall, under a large lion banner. Gregor and his men approached from the far side. The braziers cast flickering light across the scene. Bodies already littered the perimeter, felled by Gregor's unstoppable advance. There was a moment of eerie silence, broken only by the drip of water from men's cloaks and the rattle of armor. Then Gregor roared and charged. His men followed. The hall erupted in a vicious melee. Gregor smashed into the shield line like a battering ram, sending men stumbling. His sword rose and fell. He took a spear thrust to the side, but his thick plate and unstoppable rage carried him through. Lannister men died in droves, their blood staining the ornate tiles. Within minutes, it was over. Only a handful of the defenders managed to flee through side passages. The rest lay dead or dying. Gregor stood in the center of the hall, breathing heavily, rainwater and blood mixing on his armor. His men fanned out, triumphant, though battered and bloody themselves. They had done what many deemed impossible. Breached and seized the heart of House Lannister's power. The golden lion banner overhead seemed to mock the scene of devastation below. Across the realm, such news would send shockwaves. Already, word would be carried by fleeing servants or watchers that the mountain had taken Casterly Rock. Tywin, on the road, would surely be riding with all haste. But Gregor knew that by the time Tywin arrived, the fortress would be his to destroy or hold as he saw fit. This was a mortal blow to Lannister pride, a blow from which Tywin might never recover. Even if the fortress was eventually reclaimed, the legend of Tywin Lannister as an invincible strategist would be forever shattered. Gregor ordered the men to secure the gates and walls. Archers took up positions in the ramparts, cutting down the few remaining loyal defenders who tried to regroup. Others dragged out whatever captives they could find. Small pockets of resistance were crushed, their feeble attempts at defense snuffed out. The surviving castle staff, cooks, servants, maids, were rounded up in the courtyard. Some knelt trembling, expecting no mercy. Gregor gave none. A few he let live to keep the fortress functional, at least until Tywin arrived. The rest he butchered as an example. He strode through the grand corridors, gazing at the murals, the tapestries, the golden ornaments that bore witness to centuries of Lannister rule. With an almost casual gesture, he tore down a massive lion banner, letting it crumple on the floor. Then he ordered the lower vaults searched, for that was where the true wealth lay. He was no strategist, but he knew that gold was power, and that Tywin's wealth underpinned his ability to wage war. In the days that followed, Gregor's men ransacked the rock's treasures. They drank the fine wines that had been aging in the cellars, devoured the best foods still left in the pantries. Chests of gold and silver plate were dragged up from vaults. Gregor watched impassively as coins spilled across the floor, shimmering in torchlight. Some men laughed, stuffing their pockets greedily. Gregor allowed it. Gold had never been his sole motivation. He wanted to break the lion. When Tywin's outriders finally approached, they must have gazed in horror at the scene. The gates of Casterly Rock stood battered, the defenders' bodies piled in heaps, smoke rising from the fortress's innards. Gregor's men had erected crude barricades along the outer walls, manning them with archers. The lion banners were torn, replaced by no banner at all. Just the grisly sight of Lannister corpses hanging like broken dolls. Tywin's main host soon followed, arraying itself in the foothills. Thousands of Lannister men stared in disbelief at the fortress that was their ancestral pride, defiled by the mountain. Tywin Lannister, at the head of this column, would have felt a rage beyond measure. But he also confronted a bitter truth. Attacking Casterly Rock, even if compromised from within, would not be easy. Gregor's men were entrenched. The fortress's own defenses now served the traitor. A siege could last weeks or months, time Tywin did not have. Meanwhile, the presence of Gregor behind those walls was an insult, a mortal threat to the Lannister name. Tywin might starve them out eventually, but in doing so he would be pinned here, unable to respond to other threats in the realm. Desperate, Tywin sent envoys with demands for Gregor to surrender, offering him gold, amnesty, or a swift death if he refused. the envoys never returned. Gregor had them flung from the ramparts into the sea below. Their screams were lost in the crash of waves. The display hammered fear into Tywin's men. This was no negotiation. This was personal. Thus began a grim standoff. Tywin, commanding superior numbers, surrounded Casterly Rock as best he could, blocking land approaches. He established a blockade by sea with whatever ships he could muster, though it was hardly a large fleet. The idea was to starve Gregor out or force him to attempt an escape. Meanwhile, Gregor's men used the fortress's labyrinthine passages to launch surprise forays, picking off Tywin's pickets or supplies. Each day, Tywin's frustration grew. He set up trebuchets and catapults, but bombarding the rock was a difficult task, given its natural stone cliffs. Lobbing stones at the main gate accomplished little. Inside the castle, supplies ran low over time, especially with Gregor's men pillaging freely. The men grew restless, many urging Gregor to attempt a breakout or to accept some offer of gold. But Gregor would not yield. He recognized that if he surrendered, Tywin would likely flay him alive or subject him to the most agonizing death imaginable. There was no going back. As the siege wore on, Tywin's men skirmished with the defenders, losing more soldiers in fruitless assaults. Each failed attempt to breach the walls proved the monstrous irony that the best fortress in the realm, built to protect the Lannisters, now shielded their greatest betrayer. Every day, Tywin's command faced desertions, internal strife, or opportunistic attacks from other regional forces. The world saw Tywin pinned down at his own seat, unable to salvage his battered war effort. Word of the siege spread across the Seven Kingdoms, diminishing the Lannister aura of invincibility. In time, an uneasy stalemate settled. Gregor's men had lost some to disease and accidents in the damp, stale corridors. Food was rationed. Morale sagged. Some wanted to attempt a night attack on Tywin's lines, but Gregor's grim presence forestalled any notion of desertion. They knew the mountain would kill them himself if they tried. And so they waited, perched in the lion's den, a monstrous threat that Tywin dared not ignore. Meanwhile, the War of the Five Kings raged elsewhere. Robb Stark advanced, taking advantage of Tywin's preoccupation. Stannis Baratheon rebuilt his strength, forging new alliances that threatened the capital. Balon Greyjoy continued reaving the coasts. The realm fractured further, each region fending for itself. Tywin Lannister's once terrifying hold on power crumbled day by day. Thus did Gregor Clegane's betrayal, an act once unthinkable, shatter the foundation of Lannister dominance. In taking Casterly Rock, Gregor proved that even the mightiest fortress and the mightiest lord could be taken by surprise and undone from within. For the men who followed Gregor, it was a brutal, desperate existence, trapped in a fortress that had become their prison as much as their stronghold. But for Tywin, forced to lay siege to his own seat, it was the ultimate humiliation, a slow bleed of resources and prestige that would haunt him until his dying breath. Rain pattered on the scorched battlements. Corpses swung in the breeze from makeshift gallows on the outer walls. The once grand halls were dark, strewn with refuse, tapestries torn. Gregor Clegane stalked those corridors like a vengeful wraith, each footstep echoing in the gloom. He had crushed the Lannister power in a way no one else had managed. The Golden Lion was wounded, and though not yet slain, it bled. Whether the final blow would come from Gregor's sword or from the wolves in the north or the dragons rumored across the sea, no one could say. But the realm would never forget that it was the mountain that rides, a man once under Tywin's control, who delivered the greatest blow to the lion's pride. Outside, across the muddy encampments that ringed the rock, Tywin's soldiers hunched around their fires, cold and dispirited. They saw no easy victory, only the inevitability of a prolonged siege, slowly strangling the fortress. They risked the knowledge that while they starved Gregor, the rest of the realm was in flux, and House Lannister lost ground by the day. Tywin himself rarely emerged from his command pavilion, driven to fury and frustration. He had sworn to crush Gregor personally, but each plan to storm the walls ended in blood. Each day the siege dragged on, Tywin's personal legend of invincibility died a little more. In that sense, Gregor had already won. The betrayal tore out Tywin's fangs, destabilizing all the cunning strategies the old lion had built. Even if Gregor were to die behind those walls, his betrayal had changed the war's trajectory, showing every lord in Westeros that Tywin Lannister was not untouchable and that terror, once unleashed, had no master but its own appetite. And so the rain continued to fall, the thunder rolled, and the lion's roar was muffled under the grim weight of betrayal. Gregor Clegane stood on a parapet, gazing down at the sea crashing against the cliffs. The salt spray mingled with the tang of blood and smoke in the air. In the distance, through the gloom, he could see the pinpricks of Lannister campfires, 1,000 flickers of orange in the stormy night. He stood unbowed, a massive shape, and let the wind whip at his stained cloak. In that moment, it might have seemed as if the mountain was as immovable as the rock itself, a monstrous sentinel over the ruin of Lannister might. Even if the war raged elsewhere, even if kings rose or fell, here at Casterly Rock the final legacy of Tywin Lannister was written in blood and betrayal. Gregor found a grim satisfaction in that. The betrayal was complete. He had crushed the Lannister power at its core, unraveling the tapestry Tywin had spent his life weaving. No matter what came next, the realm would never be the same, and House Lannister would never again stand so high, nor cast so long a shadow. That was the mountain's triumph, a savage testament that fear, once unleashed, could even devour the hand that wielded it. With the lightning cracking overhead and the storm lashing the battlements, Gregor Clegane smiled a cruel, rare smile. The lion's roar might echo, but the mountain's silence was more terrible still. And so he stood there, in the heart of the rock, watching Tywin's torches below, unyielding, unafraid, and perhaps, in his own twisted way, victorious.